Please, just a little more time. I promise I'll pay next week. The young woman's voice cracked as she held her crying baby closer to her chest. Rain poured down on them both as she stood outside the small apartment building, her landlord's angry face glaring from the doorway. Time's up, Amy. You're 3 months behind. Out. Now. The door slammed shut with a bang that echoed through the empty street. Amy Taylor looked down at her 6-month-old son, Christopher, his tiny fists reaching up toward her face as raindrops hit his blanket. Her heart broke into a million pieces. She had nowhere to go. No money, no family to call. Just her and this beautiful baby who deserved so much more than a mother who couldn't even keep a roof over their heads. Amy pulled her thin jacket tighter and started walking down the sidewalk, not knowing where her feet would take them. The rain kept falling, each drop feeling like another reminder of how alone they were in this world. But sometimes, when we think we're completely alone, life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. If you're someone who appreciates emotional stories, we'd love for you to like and subscribe. There's more to come that might move you too. The rain hit the streets of downtown Chicago like bullets from the sky. Amy Taylor pressed her baby closer to her chest, trying to shield little Christopher from the cold drops that seemed to find every gap in her worn-out jacket. Her shoes had holes in them, and with each step, water seeped through, making her feet numb with cold. "Shh, baby. It's okay," she whispered to Christopher, who was getting fussier by the minute. "Mommy's going to find us somewhere warm soon." But Amy knew that was a lie. She had $12 in her pocket, a diaper bag with only 2 diapers left, and nowhere to go. The homeless shelter was full. She had called 3 times that morning. Her old co-workers at the diner couldn't help her either. Most of them were struggling just as much as she was. Amy looked around the busy street, watching people run past her with umbrellas and expensive coats. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. She felt invisible, like a ghost walking among the living. 6 months ago, everything had been different. She had been working double shifts at Tony's diner on the south side, saving every penny she could. The work was hard. Her feet would ache after standing for 12 hours, and the smell of grease would stick to her clothes. But she had been proud of that job. She was making her own way in the world. She shared a tiny apartment with her roommate Sarah, sleeping on a fold-out couch in the living room. It wasn't much, but it was home. She had dreams then, maybe saving enough money to go back to school, getting a degree, finding a real future. Then she met Christopher Wilson. He wasn't like the other college boys who came into the diner late at night, loud and drunk after parties. Christopher was different from his first visit on a cold Tuesday night in October. He wore simple clothes, jeans, and a Northwestern University sweatshirt. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed money. "What can I get you?" Amy had asked, filling his coffee cup. "Just coffee, please," he had said quietly. But Amy could see he was hungry. She recognized the look, the pride that kept you from admitting you needed more than you could afford. "The apple pie's really good tonight," she had said casually. "We made too much. You'd actually be doing us a favor." It was a small lie, but a kind one. Christopher's face had lit up when she set the slice in front of him. "Thank you," he said, and Amy could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. "You don't have to clean that," Amy had told him one night after watching him wipe down his table with napkins for the 3rd time that week. "My mom always taught me to clean up after myself," he had replied with that shy smile that made her heart flutter. "She said it shows respect for the people who work hard to take care of others. Besides, I like helping you." That's how their relationship started to grow. Small conversations during Amy's breaks. Christopher would stay until closing time, helping her stack chairs on tables and sweep the floor. He never asked for anything in return, never made her feel uncomfortable or like she owed him something. He was just genuinely good. Christopher told her about his classes at Northwestern, how he was studying business but wanted to teach. He volunteered at an after-school program, helping kids with homework. "Those kids remind me why I want to teach," he had said one night. "They have so much potential, but nobody believes in them." Amy was amazed by his heart. She had grown up in foster care after her parents died when she was 8. Here was someone who had everything and still chose to help kids who had nothing. Amy didn't know then that Christopher's father owned half the skyscrapers downtown, or that the Wilson name was on hospital wings across the state. Christopher never talked about his family's wealth. "I want to make a difference in kids' lives," he had told her one night as they walked to the bus stop together. "Money doesn't make you happy if you're not doing what you love." Amy had fallen in love with his heart first, then everything else followed. For 3 beautiful months, they were inseparable. Christopher would pick her up after work in his old Honda, and they would drive around Chicago, talking about everything and nothing. He showed her parts of the city she had never seen before. Quiet neighborhoods, small parks, used bookstores where they could spend hours talking. Christopher never pressured her for anything. When Amy told him about growing up in foster care, He didn't look at her with pity. "You're the strongest person I know," he had said one evening. "I had everything handed to me, and I still don't know who I am half the time. You started with nothing and built this whole life for yourself." Nobody had ever made Amy feel like her struggles had given her strength instead of just scars. But their love was a secret, and that secret bothered Amy more than she wanted to admit. Christopher said his family wouldn't understand their relationship, that they had expectations for his future that didn't include a waitress. "It's not that I'm ashamed of you," Christopher had said when Amy asked why they couldn't go public. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I just need time to make my family understand that what we have is real." Amy wanted to believe him, but doubt crept in. She would see photos of him at university events, surrounded by beautiful girls from wealthy families. Late at night, she would wonder if she was just fooling herself. Maybe Christopher was going through a phase, and when it came time to choose between his family and their love, she would be left behind. Then came that terrible night in February. Christopher had been on his way to see her after finishing a late study session at the library. The roads were icy, and a drunk driver ran a red light. The doctors said he died instantly, that he didn't suffer. Amy remembered getting the call from his roommate at 2 in the morning. She had been sleeping when the phone rang, dreaming about Christopher. Jake's voice had been shaking as he told her what happened. "Amy, I'm so sorry," Jake had said, crying on the other end of the line. "He was coming to see you. He had bought flowers and everything." Amy had dropped the phone and fallen to her knees in her tiny apartment, screaming until her throat was raw. The funeral was in all the newspapers. Heir to Wilson Fortune dies in tragic accident. There were photos of his family, his father John Wilson looking broken with grief, his mother clutching a handkerchief. Amy had stood outside the church during the service, hiding across the street in the rain. She watched hundreds of people file inside, sharing memories of the Christopher they knew, the businessman's son, the star student, the young man destined for greatness. None of them knew about the Christopher who helped clean tables at Tony's diner, who dreamed of teaching children, who made a waitress feel like a princess. 2 weeks after the funeral, Amy discovered she was pregnant. The doctor's words had echoed in her head like a drumbeat. "Congratulations, Miss Taylor. You're about 6 weeks along." Amy had sat in that sterile room, staring at the ultrasound picture, feeling joy and terror in equal measure. She had wanted to call the Wilson family, to tell them about their grandchild growing inside her. But every time she picked up the phone, she heard Christopher's voice saying his family wouldn't understand. What would they think of her? Would they believe the baby was really his? Would they try to take him away from her? Pride and fear had kept her silent. She worked at the diner until she was too pregnant to stand for long shifts. Her roommate moved out when Amy couldn't pay her share of the rent. The bills piled up like snow during a blizzard, and Amy found herself sinking deeper and deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. Christopher had been born on a snowy Tuesday morning in November. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and his father's eyes. Amy had held him and cried, not just from happiness, but from fear. She was completely alone now, responsible for this beautiful little life, with no idea how she was going to take care of him. Now, walking through the rain with her son crying in her arms, Amy felt the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. Maybe she should have swallowed her pride and called the Wilson family. Maybe she should have asked for help when Christopher was first born. Maybe. But it was too late for maybes now. All she had was this moment, this street, this storm, and a baby who needed her to be strong. Christopher's cries grew louder, and Amy realized he was hungry. She needed to find somewhere dry where she could nurse him, but every shop and restaurant looked expensive, the kind of place where a soaked woman with a crying baby wouldn't be welcome. Then she saw it, a small overhang between 2 buildings, just enough to keep the rain off. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Amy hurried over and sat down on the cold concrete, pulling her jacket around her and Christopher as she prepared to feed her son. That's when she heard the footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, coming closer through the rain. John Wilson stepped out of his black Mercedes, not caring that the rain immediately soaked through his expensive suit. His driver Marcus called out from behind him. "Sir, should I wait for you?" "No," John replied without turning around. "I need to walk." It had been 10 months since Christopher died, and John still couldn't drive past certain streets without feeling like someone had punched a hole through his chest. Today had been especially hard. He had been sitting in another board meeting, listening to executives talk about quarterly profits and expansion plans, when suddenly he couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, and all he could think about was his son. Christopher should have been there in that meeting. He should have been arguing with John about wanting to teach instead of joining the company. He should have been rolling his eyes at the corporate talk and doodling in the margins of his notebook like he used to do during family business dinners. But Christopher was gone, and John was left trying to run an empire that felt meaningless without someone to pass it on to. The rain felt good against his face as he walked down Michigan Avenue. People rushed past him with umbrellas, probably wondering why a man in a $3,000 suit was wandering around in a storm. John didn't care. Sometimes the physical discomfort of being cold and wet was easier to handle than the emotional pain that never seemed to go away. He had been walking for about 20 minutes when he heard it, the sound of a baby crying. Not the distant sound you might hear through an apartment window, but close. Very close. John looked around and spotted a small overhang between two buildings. Huddled there was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, holding a crying infant. She was soaked to the bone, her long brown hair plastered to her head, her clothes clinging to her thin frame. She looked exhausted, desperate, and completely alone. The woman was trying to adjust her jacket to create some privacy as she prepared to nurse the baby. Her hands were shaking. Whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, John couldn't tell. Maybe all three. Something about the scene made John's heart clench. Maybe it was because he couldn't stop thinking about Christopher today. Maybe it was because the woman looked so young and scared, and John remembered how terrified he and Margaret had been when Christopher was born. Or maybe it was simply because she looked like she needed help, and helping people was something John had always believed in, even when his own world felt broken. John approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was prettier than he had first realized, with delicate features and expressive brown eyes that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. But right now, those eyes were filled with fear and embarrassment. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice shook. "We're fine. We're just waiting for the rain to stop." John could see that she was anything but fine. Her lips were blue from the cold, and the baby's cries were getting more desperate. The thin jacket she was wearing was no protection against the storm, and her shoes were so worn that water was pooling around her feet. "Miss, you're both going to get sick out here," John said, his voice soft but concerned. "There's a coffee shop just around the corner. Why don't you let me buy you something warm to drink? Somewhere dry where you can take care of your baby?" The woman shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I don't need charity." John recognized that pride. He had seen it before in people who were struggling but didn't want to admit it. He had felt it himself, years ago, when his own father's business was failing and John was too stubborn to ask for help from anyone. "It's not charity," John said with a small smile. "I'm just a father who knows how hard it can be when babies get fussy. My son used to cry like that when he was hungry. The sound could drive you crazy, couldn't it?" At the mention of his son, something flickered across the woman's face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. But it was gone so quickly that John thought he might have imagined it. "Your son?" she asked quietly. "Yes," John said, though the words still hurt to say. He passed away earlier this year. Car accident." The woman's face went pale, and for a moment John thought she might faint. She stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Shock, fear, and something else. Something that looked almost like grief. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and John could hear genuine pain in her voice. "That must be... I can't imagine." "Thank you," John said. "He was a good boy. Kind, like you seem to be. He would have wanted me to help someone in your situation." The baby's cries were getting louder, and John could see that the woman was at the end of her rope. She looked like she was about to collapse from exhaustion. "Please," John said. "Just let me help you get somewhere warm. No strings attached. I promise." The woman looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. John wondered what she saw there. An old man who missed his son? A stranger offering kindness? Or something else entirely? Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. Just for a little while." John smiled and took off his suit jacket, holding it over both of them as they hurried through the rain to the coffee shop around the corner. It was a small place called Rosie's Cafe, the kind of neighborhood spot that John normally would never notice. But today, it looked like a haven. The warmth hit them as soon as they walked through the door. The woman shivered as the heat began to thaw her frozen limbs, and the baby's cries quieted slightly in the warmer air. "Find us a table in the back," John told her. "Somewhere private where you can take care of the baby. I'll get us something hot to drink." John approached the counter, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and flower in her hair looked at him with surprise. He was still an odd sight, a wealthy businessman soaking wet, with a young woman and crying baby in tow. "2 large coffees, please," John said, "and maybe some soup if you have it. Something warm and filling." "Of course, honey," the woman behind the counter said. You folks look like you've been through a storm, literally and figuratively." While they waited for the food, John looked back at the table where the young woman was quietly nursing her baby. She had found a corner booth that gave her some privacy, and the infant had finally stopped crying. The woman's shoulders had relaxed slightly, but John could see that she was still tense, still ready to run if she needed to. There was something familiar about her, something that nagged at the back of John's mind. The way she held her head maybe, or the curve of her smile when she looked down at her baby. It was like seeing someone from a half-remembered dream. "Here you go," the woman behind the counter said, handing John a tray with 2 steaming mugs and 2 bowls of chicken soup. "And don't you worry about paying right now. Anyone can see you're good people trying to help someone in need." John pulled out his wallet and left a generous tip, then carried the tray back to the table. The woman looked up as he approached, and John was struck again by how young she looked. She couldn't be more than 22 or 23, barely older than Christopher had been. "Thank you," she said as he set the coffee and soup in front of her. "You really didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," John said, settling into the seat across from her. "I'm John, by the way, John Wilson." The woman's face went white as a sheet. The coffee mug slipped from her hands, splashing hot liquid across the table. "Wilson?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," John said, concerned by her reaction. He grabbed some napkins to clean up the spilled coffee. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The woman stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, and John wondered if she was having some kind of panic attack. "What's your name?" John asked gently, though something in his gut told him he already knew the answer was going to change everything. The woman looked down at her baby, then back up at John. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "Amy," she said. "Amy Taylor." John frowned. The name didn't mean anything to him, but clearly his name had meant something to her. "Amy, have we met before?" he asked. "You seem to know who I am." Amy shook her head quickly. "No, we've never met. I recognized your name from the newspapers. Your company, Wilson Enterprises. Everyone in Chicago knows that name." It was a reasonable explanation, but something in her tone told John there was more to it than that. She was hiding something, and whatever it was big. "Amy," John said carefully, "how old is your baby?" "6 months," she replied, her voice shaking. "And the father?" Amy's eyes filled with tears. "He's dead," she whispered. "He died in February. Car accident." John felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. February. Christopher had died in February, in a car accident. "What was his name?" John asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Amy looked down at her baby, tears streaming down her face. When she looked back up at John, her expression was one of pure terror. "Christopher," she said. "His name was Christopher Wilson." The words hung in the air between them like a bomb that had just exploded. John stared at Amy, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. Christopher Wilson. His Christopher. His son. "That's impossible," John whispered. But even as he said it, he was looking at the baby in Amy's arms with new eyes. The infant had stopped nursing and was looking around with bright, curious eyes that were unmistakably familiar. Those were Christopher's eyes, John's eyes, the Wilson family eyes that had been passed down through 4 generations. "I know how it sounds," Amy said, tears streaming down her face. "I know you probably think I'm lying, trying to scam you or something. But I swear to you, I'm telling the truth. Christopher and I, we were together for 3 months. We were in love." John's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He looked at the baby again, studying the tiny features more carefully. The shape of the nose, the curve of the lips, the way the baby's hair curled at the temples. It was all so familiar. It was like looking at Christopher when he was born, 22 years ago. "Why didn't you contact us?" John asked, his voice rough with emotion. "If this baby is really Christopher's son, why didn't you call us after he died? Why didn't you tell us we had a grandson?" Amy's face crumpled with shame and grief. "Because Christopher told me you wouldn't accept me," she said through her tears. "He said his family had plans for him, that they would never understand him being with someone like me, a waitress from the South Side, someone with no money, no education, no family connections." John felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. "He said that? Christopher said we wouldn't accept you?" "Not in those exact words," Amy said quickly. "He never said you were bad people or anything like that. He said the worlds we came from were too different, that his family had expectations for his future that didn't include someone like me." John closed his eyes, remembering all the conversations he had had with Christopher about his future. The pressure he had put on his son to join the family business, to marry someone from their social circle, to live up to the Wilson family name. Had he really made Christopher feel like he couldn't bring home the woman he loved? "Tell me about him," John said suddenly. "Tell me about my son when he was with you. What was he like?" Amy's face softened, and for the first time since they had sat down, she smiled through her tears. "He was kind," she said. "So incredibly kind. He would come into the diner where I worked, always polite, always respectful. He helped me clean up after closing, and he never made me feel like I was beneath him or anything like that." She shifted the baby to her other arm, and John noticed how naturally she moved, how comfortable she was as a mother despite being so young. "Christopher talked about wanting to be a teacher," Amy continued. "He said he wanted to work with kids, to make a difference in their lives. He volunteered at an after-school program, helping children with their homework. He was so passionate about it." John's throat tightened. Christopher had mentioned wanting to teach, but John had always brushed it off, assuming it was just a phase. He had been so focused on grooming his son to take over Wilson Enterprises that he had never really listened to what Christopher actually wanted. "He was saving money to buy me a ring," Amy said softly. "He told his roommate Jake that he was going to propose to me, that he was tired of hiding our relationship. He said he was going to tell you and your wife about me, no matter what happened." "A ring?" John whispered. Amy nodded. "Jake told me after the accident. Christopher had been looking at engagement rings. He was planning to propose on my birthday in March." John put his head in his hands. His son had been planning to get married, to start a family, to build a life with this woman, and John had never even known she existed. How had he failed Christopher so completely? "I wanted to call you," Amy said, her voice breaking. "When I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to tell you so badly. But I was scared. What if you didn't believe me? What if you thought I was trying to trap Christopher for his money? What if you tried to take the baby away from me?" "We would never have taken your child away from you," John said firmly, looking up at her. "If this baby is really Christopher's son, then he's our family too. Your family too." Amy started crying harder. "I've been so scared," she said. "So alone. I had no one to help me, no one to turn to. I lost my job when I got too pregnant to work, and I couldn't afford the rent on my apartment. Today, my landlord kicked us out. We literally have nowhere to go." John felt a surge of anger, not at Amy, but at himself. His grandson had been living in poverty, while John sat in his mansion, grieving for Christopher, and never knowing that a piece of his son was still alive in the world. "What's his name?" John asked, nodding toward the baby. "Christopher," Amy said with a small smile. "I named him after his father, Christopher James Taylor." "Christopher," John repeated, and his voice broke on the name. Can I hold him?" Amy hesitated for just a moment, then carefully transferred the baby into John's arms. The moment John held his grandson for the first time, he knew with absolute certainty that Amy was telling the truth. This was Christopher's child. This was his family. The baby looked up at him with those familiar eyes, reaching up with tiny fingers to touch John's face. John started crying then, tears of grief and joy and overwhelming love for this little boy who was all he had left of his son. "Hello, Christopher," John whispered to the baby. "I'm your grandfather." Amy watched this interaction with wonder and relief. For months, she had carried the secret of who this baby really was, had struggled alone with the weight of his identity. Now finally, she had found his family. "Amy," John said, still holding the baby, "I need you to tell me everything. How you met Christopher, how your relationship developed, everything that happened. I need to understand." For the next hour, Amy told John the whole story. She told him about those first nights at the diner, about Christopher's kindness and gentleness, about their secret dates and their quiet moments together. She told him about the night Christopher died, about getting the call from his roommate, about finding out she was pregnant 2 weeks later. John listened to every word, seeing his son through Amy's eyes for the first time. This wasn't the Christopher he had known, the dutiful son who went to business school because his father expected it, who attended family functions and nodded politely at conversations about corporate strategy. This was a Christopher who was passionate and romantic and determined to make a difference in the world. "He talked about you all the time," Amy said. "He loved you so much, Mr. Wilson. But he was afraid of disappointing you. He thought you only valued him for what he could do for the company, not for who he really was." John felt like his heart was breaking all over again. He had failed his son in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I put too much pressure on him," John admitted. I was so focused on the business, on carrying on the family legacy, that I forgot to ask what Christopher actually wanted from his life. He wanted to make you proud, Amy said. That's all he ever talked about. He just wasn't sure how to do that while still being true to himself. John looked down at the baby in his arms, at this perfect little boy who would never know his father. He would have been so proud of you, he said to the baby. And he would have been a wonderful father. He would have, Amy agreed. He was already talking about teaching our son to play baseball, about reading to him every night, about all the places he wanted to take him. He was so excited to be a dad, even though we weren't planning it. John made a decision then that would change all their lives. Amy, he said, I want you and Christopher to come home with me. Today. Right now. Amy's eyes widened. Mr. Wilson, I can't accept that. I don't want charity. It's not charity, John said firmly. You're the mother of my grandson. Your family, and family takes care of each other. But your wife, Amy said. What will she think? She doesn't even know I exist. John's face tightened. Margaret was going to be shocked. There was no doubt about that. But she was also going to be overjoyed to discover she had a grandson. They had both been drowning in grief for the past 10 months, and this baby, their grandson, was like a miracle. My wife has been heartbroken since Christopher died, John said. Finding out she has a grandson is going to be the best news she's had in months. She's going to love both of you. Amy looked uncertain. I don't know how to fit into your world, Mr. Wilson. I don't know anything about being rich or fancy. I'm just a girl from the South Side who worked in a diner. And you're also the woman my son loved enough to want to marry. The woman who gave birth to his child and has been raising him alone for 6 months. That makes you one of the strongest people I know. The baby started to fuss a little, and John gently rocked him. What do you say, Amy? Will you let us help you? Will you let us be the family Christopher would have wanted us to be? Amy looked at John holding her son, saw the love and determination in his eyes, and made the decision that would change everything. Okay, she said softly. We'll come with you. The drive to the Wilson estate felt like a dream to Amy. She sat in the back of John's Mercedes, holding little Christopher, while the city blurred past the windows. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still shiny and wet, reflecting the lights of the buildings they passed. John had called his driver Marcus to pick them up from the coffee shop. Marcus, a kind man in his 50s who had worked for the Wilson family for over 15 years, had looked surprised when John introduced Amy and the baby, but he had simply smiled and helped them into the car without asking questions. Margaret is going to want to hold him the second we walk through the door, John said, turning around to look at Amy and the baby. My wife. She's been struggling since Christopher died. Some days she barely gets out of bed, but this, knowing she has a grandson, it's going to give her something to live for again. Amy felt nervous butterflies in her stomach. She had seen photos of Margaret Wilson in the society pages, an elegant woman with perfectly styled gray hair and expensive clothes, always photographed at charity galas and cultural events. What would someone like that think of a girl like Amy? What if she doesn't like me? Amy asked quietly. What if she thinks I'm not good enough for Christopher, or that I'm just trying to take advantage of your family? John's expression became serious. Amy, let me tell you something about my wife. Margaret may look fancy and proper, but she's one of the most caring people I know. She volunteers at children's hospitals. She runs literacy programs for underprivileged kids, and she has never, not once, judged anyone based on their background or bank account. He paused, looking out the window at the familiar neighborhoods. The truth is, Margaret always worried that Christopher felt too much pressure from us to be perfect. She used to tell me we were pushing him too hard, that we needed to let him make his own choices. If she knew Christopher had found someone who made him happy, someone he loved enough to want to marry, she would have welcomed you with open arms. As they drove through the wealthy suburbs north of the city, Amy watched the houses get bigger and more impressive. Finally, they turned through tall iron gates and up a long driveway lined with oak trees. At the end of the drive sat a massive stone mansion that looked like something from a movie. This is your home? Amy whispered, staring up at the imposing structure. It was Christopher's home too, John said softly. His room is still exactly the way he left it. Maybe someday, when little Christopher is older, you'd like to see it. Amy nodded, though she couldn't imagine herself belonging in a place like this. The mansion probably had more rooms than her entire apartment building. Marcus parked the car in front of the main entrance, and John helped Amy out while she held the baby. The front door was massive, made of dark wood with intricate carvings, and it opened before they even reached it. A woman appeared in the doorway, tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was wearing a simple blue dress and pearls, and despite the expensive clothes, there was something warm and approachable about her face. This was Margaret Wilson. John? Margaret called out, confusion in her voice. I wasn't expecting you home for hours. And who? Her voice trailed off as she noticed Amy and the baby. Margaret's eyes widened, and Amy saw her take in the scene. Her husband, soaking wet, with a young woman holding an infant. Margaret, John said, walking up the steps toward his wife. We need to talk. Something incredible has happened. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the baby in Amy's arms. John, what's going on? Who is this? This is Amy Taylor, John said gently. And this little boy? Margaret, this is our grandson. This is Christopher's son. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She staggered backward, gripping the doorframe for support. Her face went through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, hope, and then overwhelming joy. Christopher's son? She whispered, her eyes filling with tears. But how? When? It's a long story, John said. But Amy was Christopher's girlfriend. They were together for 3 months before he died. She's been raising his baby alone. Margaret looked at Amy with new eyes, studying her face. You loved my son, she said. And it wasn't a question. Amy nodded, tears streaming down her face. More than anything in the world. I wanted to tell you about the baby, but I was scared. I didn't know if you'd believe me, or if you'd want us in your lives. Margaret stepped forward, her hands reaching out toward the baby. May I? She asked softly. Amy hesitated for just a moment, then carefully placed little Christopher in Margaret's arms. The moment Margaret held her grandson, she started crying. Deep, sobbing tears of joy and grief mixed together. He has Christopher's eyes, Margaret whispered, staring down at the baby. Oh my God, he has his father's eyes. The baby looked up at his grandmother, seemingly fascinated by this new person. He reached up with his tiny hand and grabbed onto Margaret's pearl necklace, making her laugh through her tears. What's his name? Margaret asked. Christopher, Amy said. Christopher James Taylor. I named him after his father. Margaret's face crumpled with emotion. Christopher James, she repeated. It's perfect. John put his arm around his wife's shoulders. Margaret, Amy and the baby have nowhere to go. They were living on the streets today when I found them. I've invited them to stay with us. Margaret looked up at her husband, then at Amy. Of course they're staying with us, she said firmly. This is their home now. This is where Christopher would have wanted his family to be. Amy felt overwhelmed by their kindness. Mrs. Wilson, I don't want to impose. I know this is all very sudden, and I don't want to disrupt your lives. Disrupt our lives? Margaret laughed, still holding the baby. Sweetheart, you've just given us the greatest gift imaginable. You've brought our son back to us in the most beautiful way possible. Margaret looked down at the baby again, her voice becoming soft and tender. We've been so lost without Christopher. This house has felt so empty, so quiet. But now we have hope again. We have family again. John cleared his throat. Amy, you must be exhausted and hungry. Margaret, why don't you show Amy to the blue guest room, the one that overlooks the garden? I'll have Rosa prepare something to eat. Rosa is our housekeeper, Margaret explained to Amy. She's been with us for 20 years, and she's going to absolutely melt when she meets this little one. She loved Christopher like he was her own grandson. As they walked through the massive front hall, Amy felt like she was in a fairy tale. The ceilings were impossibly high with crystal chandeliers that sparkled in the light. Oil paintings and golden frames lined the walls, and there were fresh flowers on every table. I know it's overwhelming, Margaret said, noticing Amy's wide eyes. This house is much too big for just John and me, but it's been in the Wilson family for 3 generations. Christopher grew up here, running through these halls, sliding down the banister when he thought we weren't looking. She paused at the bottom of a grand staircase. He would have brought you here eventually, you know. Once he worked up the courage to tell us about you. You really think so? Amy asked. I know so, Margaret said confidently. John and we may have put too much pressure on Christopher about his future, but we never would have stood in the way of his happiness. If he loved you, we would have loved you too. They climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, and Margaret led Amy down a long hallway lined with family photos. Amy caught glimpses of Christopher at different ages, as a baby, a young boy, a teenager. In every photo, he was smiling, surrounded by people who clearly adored him. Here we are, Margaret said, opening the door to a beautiful bedroom. This will be your room for as long as you want it. And we'll set up a crib for little Christopher right here by the window so he can see the garden. The room was bigger than Amy's entire apartment had been. There was a 4-poster bed with soft blue linens, a sitting area with comfortable chairs, and French doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking perfectly manicured gardens. Mrs. Wilson, This is too much, Amy said. I can't accept all this. Margaret turned to face Amy, still holding the baby. Amy, may I ask you something? Amy nodded. If the situation were reversed, if you had died and Christopher was left to raise your baby alone, would you have wanted him to struggle on the streets? Or would you have wanted him to find people who loved him and wanted to help? Amy's eyes filled with tears. I would have wanted him to be safe and loved. Then that's what we're going to do for you, Margaret said simply. We're going to keep you safe and loved, because that's what Christopher would have wanted. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair appeared in the doorway. Rosa, Margaret called out. Come meet someone very special. Rosa stepped into the room and Margaret turned so she could see the baby. Rosa, this is Amy, and this little angel is Christopher's son, our grandson. Rosa's eyes widened and she pressed her hands to her heart. Dios mío, she whispered. Christopher's baby? Margaret nodded, and Rosa immediately rushed forward, her eyes filled with joy and tears. He looks just like Christopher when he was born, Rosa said, gently touching the baby's cheek. The same eyes, the same little nose. Oh, this is a miracle. Rosa looked at Amy with warmth and acceptance. You must be the girl Christopher was always talking about on the phone. He would call me sometimes when he was at school, and he would mention someone special, but he never told us her name. He talked about me, Amy asked, surprised. All the time, Rosa said with a smile. He said he had met the most wonderful girl, someone who made him laugh and think about the future in new ways. He was planning something special, I could tell. He asked me about his grandmother's ring, the one Mrs. Wilson keeps in her jewelry box. Margaret gasped. My mother's engagement ring? Christopher asked about that? Rosa nodded. Just a few weeks before the accident. He wanted to know if you would be upset if he borrowed it for something important. Amy started crying again, overwhelmed by this new evidence of how serious Christopher had been about their relationship. Margaret sat down on the bed next to Amy, still holding the baby. Amy, I want you to have that ring. It should have been yours anyway, if Christopher had lived long enough to give it to you. I can't take your family heirloom, Amy protested. Your family now, Margaret said firmly. You and this beautiful boy are Wilsons, whether you legally change your name or not, and Wilsons take care of each other. As Amy looked around at these people who had welcomed her so completely, who had embraced her and her son without question, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. For the first time since Christopher died, she believed that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. 3 months had passed since that rainy afternoon when John Wilson found Amy and baby Christopher huddled between two buildings. Now, as Amy stood in the nursery they had created for little Christopher, watching him sleep peacefully in his crib, she could barely believe how much their lives had changed. The nursery was in what used to be Christopher Sr., his childhood playroom, right next to his bedroom. Margaret had insisted on this location, saying it felt right to have the baby close to where his father had grown up. The walls were painted a soft sage green, with white furniture and shelves lined with children's books. A rocking chair sat by the window, where Amy often spent quiet moments feeding Christopher or singing to him. He's getting so big, Margaret said softly, appearing in the doorway. Over the past 3 months, Margaret had transformed from a woman consumed by grief to a devoted grandmother who couldn't get enough time with her grandson. He's starting to smile more, Amy said, turning to face her. Real smiles, not just gas. Yesterday, he smiled at John for almost a full minute when he was making silly faces at him. Margaret's face lit up. John has been so different since you both came home. Did you know he's been leaving work early every day just to spend time with Christopher? Yesterday I found him in here at 6 in the morning, just watching him sleep. Amy had noticed the change in John too. The broken man she had met in that coffee shop had gradually been replaced by a doting grandfather who carried photos of the baby in his wallet and talked about him constantly to anyone who would listen. Amy, Margaret said, settling into the rocking chair, I wanted to talk to you about something. Amy sat down on the small sofa they had placed in the corner of the nursery. Over the past 3 months, her relationship with Margaret had grown from cautious gratitude to genuine affection. Margaret had been patient and kind, helping Amy navigate the world of wealth and privilege without ever making her feel inferior or out of place. John and I have been discussing your future, Margaret said. Not because we want you to leave, never that, but because we want to make sure you have everything you need to build the life you want. Amy felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. What do you mean? We know you talked about wanting to go back to school someday, maybe get a degree. We'd like to help make that happen. John has already spoken to several universities about their programs, and we could arrange for childcare during your classes. Amy's eyes widened. She'd mentioned her old dream of going to college once, months ago, never thinking it could actually happen. "You would do that for me?" "Amy, you're not a guest here. You're family. And family invests in each other's dreams." Margaret smiled. "Besides, little Christopher is going to need a mother who feels fulfilled and proud of her accomplishments. We want you to have every opportunity Christopher Sr. would have wanted you to have." Tears filled Amy's eyes. Even after all these months of kindness, she was still sometimes overwhelmed by how completely the Wilsons had embraced her and her son. "There's something else," Margaret said, reaching into her pocket. "Something I've been meaning to give you for weeks now." She pulled out a small velvet box, the same blue color as the famous Tiffany boxes Amy had seen in movies, but never in real life. "Margaret, I can't accept any more gifts," Amy said automatically. "This isn't from John and me," Margaret said gently. "This is from Christopher. This was supposed to be yours 3 months before he died." Amy's hands shook as she took the box. Inside was the most beautiful ring she had ever seen. A classic solitaire with a diamond that caught the light and sent tiny rainbows across the nursery walls. "This was my mother's engagement ring," Margaret said softly. "She wore it for 50 years, until the day she died. I always planned to give it to Christopher when he found the woman he wanted to marry." Amy stared at the ring, imagining Christopher picking it out, planning the perfect moment to propose to her. "He really wanted to marry me," she whispered. "He really did," Margaret confirmed. "Rosa told us he had been asking about romantic restaurants, trying to plan the perfect proposal. He even asked John about his great-grandmother's wedding dress, wondering if you might like to see it someday." Amy slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "I wish he could see his son," Amy said, looking over at the sleeping baby. "I wish he could know how loved Christopher is, how welcomed we've been." "I think he does know," Margaret said. "I think somehow he guided John to that street corner on that rainy day. I think he made sure his father would find his son when you needed help the most." The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced John's arrival home from work. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his business suit, but with a smile that immediately appeared whenever he saw his grandson. "How's my boy today?" John asked softly, walking over to the crib. "He's been perfect," Amy said. "He took a long nap this afternoon, and he finished his whole bottle." John gazed down at the baby with pure adoration. "He's going to be tall like his father," he said. "Look at those long legs." "John," Margaret said, "show Amy what came in the mail today." John's face lit up, and he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "It's from Northwestern University," he said, handing it to Amy. "Your acceptance letter came." Amy's hands shook as she opened the envelope. She had applied to the education program, inspired by Christopher's passion for teaching. The letter began with the words, "Congratulations," and went on to offer her not only admission, but a full scholarship. "A scholarship?" Amy asked, looking up at John and Margaret. "The Christopher Wilson Memorial Scholarship," John said proudly. "We established it in our son's honor, for students who want to become teachers. You're the first recipient." Amy started crying, overwhelmed by their generosity and by the beautiful way they had chosen to honor Christopher's memory. "We know it's what he would have wanted," Margaret said. "He believed in education, in helping others, in making a difference in children's lives. Now you can do that too, in his name." Baby Christopher stirred in his crib, making the soft cooing sounds that always made the adults in the room smile. Amy stood up and lifted him, marveling at how much he had grown in just 3 months. "Your daddy would be so proud," she whispered to the baby. "He would be so proud of the family we've found, of the love we've been given." John put his arm around Amy's shoulders. "Christopher is proud," he said. "And more than that, I think he's happy. He loved you, Amy, and he wanted you to have a good life. He wanted his son to grow up surrounded by love and opportunity. And that's exactly what's going to happen," Margaret added, standing to join their little family group. "This little boy is going to grow up knowing how much his father loved his mother, how much his grandparents loved them both, and how much hope and joy he's brought into our lives." Amy looked around at the beautiful nursery, at the family who had welcomed her so completely, at the sleeping baby who would never want for love or support. 6 months ago, she had been alone and desperate, with no idea how she was going to provide for her child. Now, she was part of something bigger, a family that honored Christopher's memory by loving the people he had loved. "I want to tell him stories about his father," Amy said suddenly. "When he's older, I want him to know about the man Christopher really was, not just the successful businessman everyone expected him to become." "We all will," John said. "We'll tell him about his father's kindness, his dreams, his gentle heart. We'll make sure he knows that Christopher was a man who chose love over expectations, who cared more about helping others than making money. Margaret wiped away a happy tear. And we'll tell him about his mother's strength and courage, about how she raised him alone when she could have given up, about how she honored his father's memory by being the best mother she could be. Baby Christopher opened his eyes and looked up at the three adults surrounding him with so much love. His tiny hand reached up toward Amy's face, and she caught his fingers in hers. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to him. "Better than okay. We're going to have a beautiful life, full of love and possibilities your daddy dreamed of for us." Outside the nursery windows, the sun was setting over the Wilson estate gardens, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was the kind of evening that felt full of promise, full of hope for all the good things yet to come. John and Margaret left Amy alone with the baby for their nightly bonding time. As she settled into the rocking chair with Christopher in her arms, Amy thought about how much had changed since that desperate day in the rain. She had found more than shelter that afternoon. She had found home. She had found family. She had found a future worthy of the man she had loved and lost. And as she rocked her son to sleep, humming the same lullaby she used to sing to him when they had nothing but each other, Amy knew that Christopher Sr. would be proud of the life they were building, the love they had found, and the bright future that lay ahead for his son. The little boy who had been born into uncertainty and poverty would grow up surrounded by love, opportunity, and the knowledge that he was the bridge between his father's memory and his family's future. He would carry on Christopher's legacy of kindness and compassion, and he would never, ever be alone. In the growing dusk of that peaceful evening, 3 generations of the Wilson family were together at last, bound not just by blood, but by love, hope, and the unbreakable connections that survive even death. And in the quiet nursery, where a baby slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms, the future looked brighter than any of them had dared to dream.